She had never said the word serious out loud to a stranger before, and yet there it was, written in her own hand, folded into an envelope she was about to hand to a man she had never met. Some decisions don't feel like decisions until you're already living inside them. My name doesn't matter yet, you'll know it soon enough, but I was 29 years old that autumn, standing in a post office in a town I already knew I'd never see again, holding a letter that smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. A widower in the New Mexico territory needed help running a vineyard. Room, board, fair wages, and if things worked out, marriage. No promises beyond that. I had $11, a trunk that didn't close all the way, and a boarding house that wanted me gone by the end of the week. So I wrote back, one word, serious. The town where I got off the train wasn't much of a town at all. A water tower, a mercantile with a busted window, a livery that smelled like every livery I'd ever known. The wind came sideways off the flats and got into everything. My collar, my hair, the hem of my traveling dress, like it was taking inventory before deciding whether to let me stay. He was waiting at the bottom of the platform steps, taller than I expected. Somewhere near 40, though the sun and the work had aged him past what the calendar probably said. He held his hat in both hands, not out of manners exactly, more like it was something to do with them. He said my name like it was a question he wasn't sure he'd get right. I said yes. That was all it took. He lifted my trunk without asking and walked it to the wagon. I followed. Neither of us said a word the whole ride out of town, and I remember thinking that the silence between two strangers can be its own kind of conversation, if you let it. Then the road dropped, and the valley opened up beneath us, and I saw the vines. They ran up the slope in long, uneven rows, gone gold and rust-colored in the October light, more of them than I'd ever pictured from 2 lines in a letter. Acres, not a garden, not a hobby. A whole hillside of something that had clearly once been somebody's entire life. At the bottom sat a low house built from pale stone, a barn beside it, and a smaller structure I couldn't yet place. "How long have you been running this by yourself?" I asked. He kept his eyes on the road. 3 years. I looked back at the vines. Some rows still held their shape. Others had gone wild, posts leaning like drunk men, canes tangled into each other with no one to tell them otherwise. I didn't say anything else. Neither did he. The wagon rolled on down into the valley, and something in my chest tightened the way it does right before you find out whether you've made a mistake. The house was older up close than it looked from the ridge. The mortar between the stones patched over and over in slightly different shades, like a wound that kept reopening in the same place. Inside was one main room, a table, 2 chairs, an iron stove, a shelf holding 4 dented tins. A second door closed led to what I assumed would be mine. The window there faced east, a narrow bed. A washstand, a single hook on the wall for whatever I owned. "The chickens are your first job if you're willing," he said, nodding toward the barn. I followed him around back to a low wire coop. Maybe 14 birds, moving with that jittery, half-starved energy that told me everything about how long they'd been an afterthought. The water pan had gone green at the rim. The feed trough was nearly bare. "They've been getting by," he said. It wasn't quite an excuse, and it wasn't quite an apology either. "They have," I said, which wasn't quite forgiveness. I found a bucket on a nail, filled it at the well twice, dumped what was left of the grain barrel into the trough, and watched the birds crowd toward it like they'd forgotten food could show up on a schedule. He stood a few feet off with his hands shoved in his coat pockets the whole time, watching me the way you watch whether you can't do anything about yet. I want you to remember that image, a woman who'd stepped off a train 2 hours earlier, already elbow-deep in someone else's neglect, because everything that happened after started right there. At a chicken trough, before either of us had said a single word about what we actually wanted from each other. That night I made cornbread and eggs from the coop I just fed, and he sat down at the table still wearing his coat. The way men do, when they've been eating alone so long they've forgotten a table is meant to be shared. "How long has the vineyard looked like that?" I asked. He turned his fork over once before answering. 2 years, maybe 3. A pause. "My wife knew the vines. I knew just enough not to ruin things while she was alive. After I knew less than I thought I did." That was enough of an answer. I didn't push. "The lateral growth needs cutting before anything else," I said instead. "The side shoots off the main canes. If you take them now, before they pull any more strength from the roots, some of the older wood still has a chance. He looked up. You know vineyards. My father grew table grapes, not wine, but a vine doesn't care what you're planning to do with it later. The principle's the same. He set his fork down and looked at me, really looked. The kind of look that goes on a beat too long to be casual and not long enough to be rude, and neither of us filled the silence that followed. Then he picked his fork back up. All right, he said, that was the whole exchange. No ceremony, no negotiation, just two people agreeing without quite saying so to try. I was up before the light the next morning, a borrowed pruning knife in hand, working the second row when he came out to feed the birds. He didn't ask where I'd found the knife. He watched from the end of the row for a moment, then went about his own work, and something about that, the way he let me be without hovering, without doubting out loud, told me more about him than a week of conversation could have. By mid-morning, I'd cleared 2 rows and started a third. He brought water without being asked, set the cup on a fence post, and disappeared back toward a gate latch that had needed fixing since spring. Neither of us checked on the other. The sound of my knife against the cane was the only conversation the vineyard needed that day. At noon, I washed up and found bread and hard cheese waiting. My forearms were striped with small scratches from the canes. I hadn't noticed he had. How bad is it? He asked. Rows 3 and 4 are past saving. The root damage goes deeper than the canes let on. But 5 and 6 might hold if we cut clean now and keep water at the base while the mornings stay cool. He was quiet a moment. What do you need? Stakes, wire. In about 6 weeks with no late frost. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the shape a smile leaves behind when it decides not to finish forming. Here's the thing about a dying vineyard, and about a marriage built out of a 2-line letter. You don't fix either one with a single gesture. You fix it in small, unglamorous choices, day after day, long before you're sure it's worth the effort. And I want you to sit with that thought, because it matters for what happens later in this story. He rode into the nearest supply town the following morning with a list I'd written on the back of the original letter, the only paper in the house with a blank side. 16 stakes, heavy-gauge wire. Twine. He came back with more than I'd asked for, a coil of thicker wire, a second ball of twine still wrapped in its paper. A small crate of staples I hadn't requested, but would have needed inside the week. Neither of us mentioned it. We just worked that whole afternoon, side by side but apart, me cutting, him driving new stakes into ground gone hard with autumn. A boy appeared at the edge of the row sometime after midday, watching with the particular seriousness children reserve for work they don't yet understand. That was Ezra, his son, 7 years old, quiet in the way children get when they've learned early that grown-ups don't always come back the same after they leave a room. He carried 2 cups of water out to us, holding them with both hands the way someone had clearly taught him to. Is it getting better? He asked me, looking down the row at the cut canes lying neat along the base of the new wire. Not yet, I told him. But it knows what we want from it now. He thought about that for a long moment, the way children do when you've said something that sounds like it might be true. And then he went back toward the house. That evening I stayed at the table past supper with a notebook, rough sketches of the rows, pencil numbers tracking the space between old wood and new cuts. He looked at it and didn't look away. This middle section needs the wire raised 4 inches by spring, I said. Posts won't hold that tension at that height. They will if we cross-brace every third one. He was quiet, not the quiet of disagreement, the quiet of a man doing arithmetic in his head. That's more timber than I've got. I know. I was going to ask about the mill. Holly's Bragg runs it. He'll want cash. Or trade. Trade what? I turned to a blank page and wrote a number, the yield I expected from the 3 rows I'd judged worth saving that season. Not the whole vineyard. Just what I actually believed in. You don't know that, he said. No. But neither does Bragg. Something shifted in his face then, quick and gone before it finished, not quite a smile again, but closer this time. I'll write to the mill Tuesday, he said. Tuesday came in gray and heavy with a rain that never quite fell. I was in the older block when he rode out earlier than I expected, the horse's hooves flat and strange in the thick air. He didn't dismount right away. I was crouched at the base of one of the older vines, 2 fingers pressed into the soil at the root crown, reading the way the ground held together instead of how it looked. "Found something?" he asked. "The drainage here holds water longer than it should." He tied off the horse, walked over, and crouched beside me without asking, pressing his own fingers into the same spot. "It flooded once," he said after a while. "Year I turned 9, my father lost this whole block." I looked at the vines again, older than the rest, but not by much. Replanted after the flood, which meant a generation younger than their thick trunks suggested. Stressed young and forced to adapt. "That's why they hold water differently," I said. "Not bad drainage. Different roots, they learn to store more than they need because they remember not having enough." He didn't say anything for a while. Then quietly, "You think that's in the fruit too? I think it might be exactly where the difference is." He stood, hands in his coat pockets, looking down the row like he was seeing it for the first time in years. "What did you find at the mill? They'll take more. If we can deliver steady volume by fall, Bragg said he'd contract us for next year too." He nodded slowly. "I need to understand the whole plan," he said. "All of it. Tonight," I told him. "I'll have it ready. Now, before I tell you what I put on that table. I want you to picture the kind of trust it takes to hand a stranger your whole future in the shape of a hand-drawn map and a column of numbers. Because that's exactly what I did that night, and what happened next changed the direction of everything. I laid it all out on the kitchen table under the lamp, a map I'd sketched myself, penciled measurements along every edge, a ledger of costs against yield for the past 2 seasons, side by side. And one small, folded square of paper I set nearest to him without a word of explanation. He read the map first, turning it slightly like he was orienting it to something only he could see. Then the numbers, his eyes moving without hurry down each column while the wind picked up along the roofline. "East section's underperforming by 1/3, he said finally. "Drainage and the shade off the ridge." I nodded. That wasn't agreement so much as filing something away. "What's this?" He touched the folded square. "What I want to plant." He opened it. 6 varietal names, circled at the edges in my own hand. His expression didn't change in any way I could point to, but something in his shoulders settled, less like tension leaving, more like a decision landing. "That's not a small ask," he said. "The east section would need clearing, new rootstock. You'd lose 2 full seasons of fruit." "I know. Why these 6? They take longer to establish. But the root system they build runs deeper than anything we've got out there now, more resistant to drought. And once the fruit comes in, the mill would take everything we could grow of them." Bragg told me as much without meaning to. He was quiet a long moment. "That's a long wager." "Yes." He looked at me then, not the map, not the numbers, me. It held a beat longer than a simple business conversation required, and neither of us moved to end it first. "Show me the drainage problem tomorrow," he said. "Before the light goes." Winter arrived the way it does in high desert country all at once, and then it simply stayed. The ground hardened. I found a rhythm in the short days. The stove lit before sunrise, the ledger after breakfast, the cellar checked in the thin warmth of early afternoon. He spent that season cutting posts for the east repair, and I could hear the axe from the house. A clean, patient sound in air so cold it seemed to sharpen every noise that traveled through it. He never asked me to come watch the work. I never offered. But one gray morning I walked the damaged row alone and studied the slope of the ground, the direction water would travel once the thaw came. And went back inside and adjusted a number in the ledger, the drainage estimate, revised upward by 15%. He saw the new figure 3 days later, standing at the table still in his coat. "You changed it," he said. "The slope steeper than I first measured." He nodded, sat, took his coat off, and looked at the rest of the page. That was the end of it, no argument, no defense. Just 2 people learning to trust each other's numbers. Ezra had taken to following me into the cellar those cold afternoons, carrying the smaller bottles, holding the candle steady while I made notations by lamp light. He didn't talk much down there. The place seemed to press the noise out of a person, the cold stone, the smell of oak, something almost reverent about it. One afternoon I let him taste a spoonful from the oldest cask, the one I'd marked untouchable. He held it in his mouth with great seriousness, swallowed, and said, "It tastes like the rain before it gets here." I looked at him a long moment. "That's exactly right," I said. Something eased in his face, the particular relief of a child who said something honest and been believed instead of corrected. I made a small mark on the label, not his words. Just a date and a symbol only I would ever understand the meaning of. Christmas came without announcement, the way it does out there. A hard frost overnight, still holding at noon the next day, the whole valley gone silver. He'd moved his cot out to the small room off the tack barn back in November on his own without asking, and I never remarked on it, and neither did he. On Christmas morning, I found a length of cotton twill folded flat on the cellar step, a darker blue than I'd have picked for myself, and exactly the right weight for the cold months ahead. No note. I didn't go looking for him to say thank you. I just wore it down among the casks that afternoon, and neither of us mentioned it, and somehow that silence said more than words would have. In January, I found the ledger off. Not dramatically, just a slow discovery, a morning of running the same column 3 times and arriving at the same answer twice too many. 17 bottles missing from the autumn racking. I searched the cellar shelf by shelf and found them stacked behind a half-empty cask I rarely moved, wrapped individually in old cloth, packed with straw. I stood there a long while, understanding what I was looking at. He'd set these aside in autumn, before he even knew whether the harvest would hold. His own quiet judgment about what deserved keeping, made without asking me, without waiting for permission. Every single bottle he'd chosen was one I would have chosen myself. That evening, I set 2 cups on the table instead of 1. I heard him come in from the cold, heard the particular weight of his coat settling against the hook, a sound I realized I now knew by heart. He sat, wrapped both hands around his cup, and after a while said quietly to no one in particular, "East Row looked good today." I nodded, still facing the window. Outside, the frost held past dark, and in the cellar, 17 bottles waited in their cloth wrappings for a spring that neither of us had spoken about yet, though I think by then. We both already knew it was coming. And here's where I need you to lean in a little closer, because the spring that followed wasn't just about grapes. It was about whether 2 people who'd built an entire life out of practical arrangements were finally ready to admit it had become something else. Spring didn't arrive all at once that year. It came in pieces, a morning when the frost didn't return by noon, a week of steady rain, and then one afternoon when I stepped outside and the air had simply changed. I stood in it a long moment before going back in, the way you do when your body understands something before your mind catches up. He'd already started the East Row by then. I'd watch him from the kitchen window, moving between the vines with that same slow, deliberate attention I'd come to recognize as entirely his. Not slow because he was unsure, but because he was looking, really looking, the way you look at something you've decided to keep. I didn't go out to help that first week. I had my own work, the ledgers, the correspondence with a merchant down in Santa Fe who'd written again, more urgently this time. I answered carefully, promising nothing I couldn't deliver. By the second week, I was carrying his midday meal out to the East Row myself, setting the cloth on the flat stone he used as a table when he worked too far out to come back to the house. He lifted his head when he heard me coming. I turned and walked back before he could say anything, and I remember smiling the whole way, for no reason I could have explained to anyone at the time. That afternoon, I found the cellar door standing open. He'd carried the 17 bottles up into the light himself, still wrapped in their cloth, and set a single glass beside them on the workbench. I was still standing in the doorway when he came in from the south field, hands still dark with soil. He stopped when he saw me looking at the bottles. "The buyer should see these first," I said. "Yes," he said, "that was all. That was enough." The merchant arrived in late April, a careful-eyed man who walked the rows without a word and spent a long time down in the cellar afterward. When he finally came up, he made an offer. I countered. He looked at me the way men sometimes do when a woman surprises them into recalculating everything they'd assumed about a negotiation. And then he accepted, and was gone south by supper. I sat at the table afterward with the paperwork spread in front of me, and after a while he came in and poured 2 cups without asking, setting one down near my hand before pulling out his own chair. The evening light lay long and even across the floor. Outside, the East Row moved slightly in the wind, leaves still small, still pale with their newness. The whole valley seemed to be holding its breath the way it does at the edge of a season, when nothing's been decided out loud yet. But the direction of things has already become impossible to mistake. I picked up my cup, he stayed, I stayed. And for the first time since I'd stepped off that train with a trunk that didn't close and $11 to my name, I understood that I wasn't just minding someone else's vineyard anymore. I was standing in the middle of my own life, and it had turned out to be exactly the one I'd have chosen if anyone had thought to ask me back at that post office window. So here's what I keep coming back to whenever I tell this story. It wasn't the wine that saved that place, and it wasn't the letter either. It was two people who kept showing up for the unglamorous, unromantic work of fixing something broken, day after day, long before either of them was willing to call it love. If you'd gotten a letter like that one, a stranger, a struggling piece of land, and nothing but a promise to try, would you have written back? I'd really love to know what you'd have done in my place. Drop it in the comments, and let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. If this one found you at the right moment, give it a like. Share it with someone who'd appreciate a slow burn story about second chances. And subscribe if you want more of these waiting for you next time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one.